Hello and welcome to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. Today, we're going off on an adventure together as we explore the ghost theaters of Callowhill Street. Those of you who've come along with me on one of my Philadelphia theater history walking tours in the past know that I sometimes jokingly say, I see dead theaters. In fact, almost anyone unlucky enough to be walking or driving along a Philly street with me these days gets to hear that same joke. I've been studying Philly theater history for so long that I can point out literally hundreds of places that were once playhouses or theaters right there. Well, some are still there, of course, but most of them are long gone now, in the way these things go. Sometimes these long-vanished venues existed only for a few months, and sometimes they've been gone for 200 years. Sometimes the buildings, or at least the theater's original exterior walls, are still there, just turned to a different purpose. Sometimes they've been totally razed and replaced, but I still see them in my mind's eye because I've researched them so deeply. I can't seem to help it. A hazard of the profession, I suppose. This happens especially when I walk along the classic historic corridors of Philly theater, South Street, or Broad Street, or Chestnut Street, or Walnut Street, but that's not where we're going to walk today, you and I. We're taking a different route. One I've never covered in any actual theater history walking tour. But let's talk about the near North Side and the ghost theaters of Callowhill Street. Callowhill Street was named after Hannah Callowhill, William Penn's wife, who, after his death in 1718, was technically the proprietor of the colony until her own death 5 years later. This was not originally a part of the city that was Philadelphia proper. Remember, of course, the city's northern border was Vine Street, and it's just to the north of that. The eastern part of Callowhill Street was in the independent borough of Northern Liberties. Some call it the Quaker City's first suburb. Though at first Northern Liberties was designed to be filled with small gardens and green spaces, its grid of streets was quickly filled, just like Philadelphia's, with tightly packed houses, churches, warehouses, and tenements. To the west of 6th Street, Callowhill Street ran through another independent borough with a similarly bucolic name, Spring Garden. But by 1854, during the Great Consolidation, which puts the entirety of Philadelphia County into one sprawling metropolis, these were all part of Philadelphia, and both of them were heavily German neighborhoods, some Irish as well. And after the Civil War, there came Latvians, Slovaks, and Romanian immigrants too, and many of these Orthodox churches and social clubs from those groups can still be found there. In the late 19th and early 20th century, these neighborhoods became increasingly industrial as capitalists raised whole blocks of houses to create mills and warehouses. Philadelphia factory owners and brewers especially valued the proximity to both the Delaware River docks to the east and the Reading Railroad tracks that led out of the city. The Reading tracks fanned out at the Delaware waterfront, leading to hundreds of freight terminals and docks where huge quantities of Pennsylvania coal went out to the ships and piles of lumber came back in. To the north of that were the huge Cramp shipyards turning out merchant and marine vessels, and in the middle of this area of town sat the Betts Brewery, spewing millions and millions of gallons of beer. Over the far western border of the neighborhood, beyond Broad Street, arose the huge Baldwin Locomotive Works. But during the economic dislocations following World War I and the Great Depression, the neighborhood's economy slowed down. Plus, it got literally stomped on when the Bed-Franklin Bridge in New Jersey built huge stone footings and entrance ramps just to the south, and thereafter fleets of trucks and cars coming off the bridge swept into the narrow old streets, or else got stuck in traffic jams. Then, in the mid-20th century, the cars won, and folks got in them and drove off. The factories and breweries closed. Most of the jobs left for elsewhere in the area, even faster than it had grown. The huge population quickly emptied out. Ripe for urban renewal highway projects, a huge swath of the city blocks in this neighborhood were wiped out to build that crosstown highway connector between I-95 and the Schuylkill Expressway that we now call the Vine Street Expressway. 676, if you're nasty. Even today, if you know the area at all, you've seen it and wanted to forget it. It rises like an aqueduct along Callowhill Street and then bends a little south and then runs along closer to where Vine Street used to be before it plunges down into the earth, into the excavated canyon, beneath Broad Street, beneath the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, roaring along just under street level before it bursts free and rises up again over the bridge beyond the Schuylkill River. Now, naturally enough, for decades, back in Callowhill Street, the remaining neighborhood after this highway went through was left shattered. It was literally bracketed by massive concrete pilings to the south and oppressed by traffic sounds 24 hours a day. Drug customers using this new highway could easily slip in and out of town and meet their dealers and then jump right back on the highway and drive off. Seedy bars and derelict buildings were everywhere. It was around Callowhill where the film director David Lynch hung out in the late 1960s when he was an art student at PAFA. Ironically, he enjoyed the creepiness, the graffiti, the emptiness, its brutality. He told an interviewer in 1987, thinking back to those days of his youth, "Yes, Philadelphia is horrible, but in a very interesting way. There were places there that had been allowed to decay, where there was so much fear and crime that just for a moment there was an opening to another world. It was fear, but it was so strong, so magical, like a magnet." Today, I'm happy to report that the area has changed since David Lynch lived there 50 years ago. In recent decades, it has become filled with hip new apartment buildings, converted warehouses and such, as young professionals and developers take advantage of its proximity to Center City. And someday, of course, it will change again into who knows what. But you ask me, why are you talking about this part of town? Does it have a theater history? Why, yes. Yes, it does. Amazingly, impressively, it does. Come with me as I see dead theaters along Callowhill Street, visiting the lost historic Philadelphia Theater District of the near North Side. Our first stop is that weird little strip of buildings that somehow survived the highway construction in between the river and 95, just north of the Ben Franklin Bridge. Though it's mostly gentrified now, this was once a working-class area, part of the docklands of Philadelphia. Between some buildings, you can still find old stone steps leading down to what was once the Delaware River waterfront, although that's farther away by now. If we stop in front of 103 Callowhill Street, we can see a series of 3 black French doors with curtained glass panels. Beside them, to the right, is a red door with a little sign above it that reads, "The Hannah." This is not to be confused with The Hannah, a large new apartment complex about 5 blocks away. This is, in fact, the Hannah Callowhill stage. I've been privileged enough to see inside it once on a tour, but in fact, there's no theater there right now. The lower level of this building is mostly an archaeological site where its owners, Matt and Melissa Dunphy, who live on the upper floors, dig into the old 18th century privy pits beneath. They found some amazing pottery and glass down there. Now, I don't want to tell you too much of their story because they have done it so much better themselves. And if you ever have time, find the early episodes of their podcast called The Bog House. It's quite a treat. But to summarize it quickly, there was once a theater here in the early 2000s. The ground floor of this rather rickety old 18th century building had been renovated by a guy named Joseph Grasso to become Grasso's Magic Theater. It was open from about 2009 to 2014. Judging from photos of the place in newspaper articles, I can still find a small foyer led to a seating area where folks could sit around little cafe tables. There was a proscenium stage with lights and curtains. It looked kind of neat. Here, Mr. Grasso and various other local magician friends of his would have shows, featuring them doing little sleight of hand tricks and sometimes accompanied by raunchy burlesque dancers. It made a minor sensation in Philly nightlife, I guess, for about 5 years, until 2014, when Joseph Grasso was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage girl at his home out in Montgomery County. Turned out that some of the other magicians he had been hosting were sex offenders too. It all got pretty alarming, and it was very revolting. Anyway, he went to jail, and then I think he died, and that was the end of Grasso Magic Theater. Now, when Matt and Melissa bought this place a few years afterwards, thinking they would turn it into a cool little offbeat performance space for Philly Fringe shows, Melissa is a composer of some note and works often in edgy Philly theater circles. It turned out that the construction of Grasso Magic Theater was all terrible. Just awful, not up to code. Dangerously so, in fact. They had to rip it all out and build a new apartment above it, and while they were doing that, they discovered the privy pits, and then they became archaeology buffs and Philly history sleuths. Again, I won't tell their story. They do it so much better. But someday, I hope they will finally put a theater back in there again. It's a nice spot for it. Okay, now we'll head up the hill of Callowhill, and we'll walk under the roaring clamor of I-95, which has an overpass here, curving away and then heading to the west. It'll take us about 10 minutes to walk this way, as eventually we leave the highway behind us. Our next stop is 415 Callowhill Street. As we pause here to catch our breath, look to the northwest corner. Now you're looking at the parking lot for the recently constructed Gift of Life Howie's House. A little farther up 4th Street, you can see it. Howie's House is a charitable /healthcare /housing concern that serves as its website says, home away from home, a temporary housing for patients and their families who travel to Philadelphia's many hospitals and are waiting for kidney and liver transplants, that sort of thing. It's kind of historically apt, in fact, that this is a place for those who are making a journey. Because right here on 4th and Callowhill, we're standing right along the terminus of what was once a very old Indian trail, dating back to the time of the Lenni Lenape, who used it for foot journeys heading up and across the Delaware Valley over to the Hudson River. In the 18th century, it became the Old York Road, which in colonial times expanded that old Indian trail. Though it was called the Old York Road, it was in fact the way to New York. It was quite busy, in fact, the major highway north of Philadelphia, leading to Trenton and then across New Jersey to Hoboken, filled with carriages and horses. And then you could get a ferry to Manhattan. Our old friend George Washington came back this way with the retreating Continental Army in 1776, as did our friend George Frederick Cook in 1811, as he came down from doing shows up in New York to appear in Philly at the Chestnut Street Theater. But eventually, as Philadelphia grew, the city itself started traveling up this way, spreading houses and taverns and warehouses, as we mentioned at the beginning. A church was built right here in the 1840s. And then in the 1850s, the house of worship, in the ways of things, was converted into a temple of culture, a theater. In its new form, the facade was given tall, arched, Rundbogenstil windows, so typical of German architecture of the mid-19th century, like its contemporary, the Academy of Music. But unlike the still living and glowing Academy on Broad Street, this is the story of a zombie theater, which was filled with theatrical life for a few decades, and then died, and then stayed undead. As this neighborhood boomed and filled with immigrants in the 1850s, all traces of the Lenape were disregarded. But if ever there was a Philly theater that really needed to have a land acknowledgement statement made in its programs, this was it. as it were next to the old Lenny Lenape Road, but it didn't, and perhaps it was a little cursed as a result. I'll remind you that I mentioned this theater too in our episode 12, Stages of Fire, because during this time it was known as the Atlantic Garden. It almost burned down and then was rebuilt, but its story is even more fascinating complex than that. I found a clipping from the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin dated November 28th, 1939. I've reordered it a little bit, but I'll read it to you. It tells the story of the Concordia. The Concordia had started life as the City Museum and Star Hall in 1854. It says it was opened with a performance of As You Like It. Samuel Ashton and Company were listed as the proprietors, who stated that they proposed to offer only first-class attractions for the edification of lovers of the dramatic arts. For those who weren't quite up to Shakespeare, the lower story of the two-story building was given over to what the managers called an elegant temple of science and pleasure. This looks to have been mostly stuffed birds, seashells, and rock collections, but there was also, quote, an Indian cabinet, where the handicraft of Aborigines was on view at 25 cents a look. Through the Civil War period, the theater was one of the city's most fashionable playhouses, until it was swept by fire in 1868. It was rebuilt the next year, and a gallery was added. Thereafter, it led a checkered career. It was renamed the Concordia, and it was the home for a number of years of light operas in German. Most of the Gilbert Sullivan operas were presented in German translation of the old Concordia. Many foreign stars played here as well, including Madame Januszek. After 1880, the theater went into a decline. For a period, it hosted Lou Simmons' Minstrel Company. After that, it was used intermittently for the entertainment of various German and Jewish societies of the neighborhood, until it passed into the hands of the Philadelphia beer king, John Betts, sometime near 1890. For 50 years, it had been a bottling plant, a small part of the huge red brick Victorian pile of the massive Betts Brewery. Bottling machines filled the lower floors. In the peanut gallery where the gods of 1870 looked down upon the world of fashion in the parquet circle and munched candy as they watched East Lynne, empty beer cases were stored. During the Prohibition of the 1920s, the brewery closed, and empty cases just stayed there, gathering dust. But now, in 1939, says the article, the old Concordia Theater, which turned out its gas lights and lowered its last curtain so long ago that only our grandfathers remember it, came back to life. Last August, when the Liebman Company bought the Betts property at a bankruptcy sale, it planned to raise the whole brewery, the bottling plant, along with the rest. It was then that a survey of the property revealed the proscenium arch of the old theater and the curved sweep of the gallery railing. Researches were made, and the old Concordia began to re-emerge from its dust. Now a happy ending lies ahead, a career as a furniture warehouse for J.B. Liebman and Company. And there the newspaper article ends, but of course, back in 1939, the reporter for the Evening Bulletin could not see into the future any more than we can. It's true that the theater survived for a while as a furniture warehouse, but times kept changing. The old theater building on 410 Callowhill Street, which has survived so many things for so long, a literal zombie theater in a city with so many other theatrical ghosts, was finally torn down in 1971 when the massive crosstown Vine Street Expressway project forever transformed the neighborhood. All right, let's keep moving along here. 6 more blocks to the west, we'll go by a lot of tall apartment buildings and new restaurants and so forth. It's more upscale here than I remember it even 20 years ago. If you look at old maps of the city, Callowhill used to be extra broad here, all the way from 4th to 7th Street. And that's because there used to be a long strip of market stalls in the center from 4th to 7th, replacing the market that once stood along Market Street. It was because of this wide anomaly that later city planners seized on this road to drive up highway through here, because it meant they had to knock down less building. As we pass by 7th Street, at last, we can see to the north, beyond Willow Street, what is now called the Franklin Music Hall. but to Philadelphians of an older generation, it will always be the Electric Factory, music venue for rock and roll that was carved out of the old General Electric switchgear plant. At 7th, Callowhill now takes an odd little jog to the south, so we'll head a little to the left and then over to the right. Again, this is an artifact of that long ago market area, which ended right here. We now walk 3 more blocks to the west. Here we cross Ridge Avenue, that long, weird diagonal artery that cuts right across from here all the way through North Philadelphia. This is a relic of an early 19th century industrial turnpike that went all the way to Pottstown and Reading. It begins just a block to the south on Wood Street. Now, on the southwest corner of this 5 Points intersection, you can see a large, rectangular 2-story building painted uniformly gray with some bright spots and murals on the outside. And gray is appropriate because this is a ghost of a former Philly theater standing in plain sight. It is, in fact, the old National Theater. The corner of 10th and Callowhill Streets in Philadelphia has a long history in popular entertainment in the city, since it was a bustling intersection and also near the railroad. In the late 1860s, it became the first home of the Great National Circus Company, organized by Adam Forepaugh, that Philadelphia circus tycoon who was a great rival of P.T. Barnum. And as we know, circuses originally performed in theater buildings, not tents, though this was about to change. Eventually, Forepaugh would establish the winter quarters for his huge touring circus company somewhat farther to the north at Mercer and Lehigh, where some of his former stable buildings remain even today. By the 1870s, though, this former circus had become a real theater under the management of William Gilmore. Though it catered to a somewhat, well, let's say down-market crowd, once again, in a rather rare image of the theater that I found, we can see it had a facade with those ruined Bogenstiel windows. This was then a German neighborhood, remember. But despite these respectable-looking windows, the theater at the corner of 10th and Callowhill had been a nuisance to the neighbors, and neighbors complained that there was public drinking and rude behavior frequently spilling out onto the street. Bad language was often heard, according to the newspapers. Quote, some of the parties would hail their companions in a boisterous manner, such as, "Halloo, Scuds! Mickey!" And occasionally a girl would greet another female in a manner not over polite. Close quotes. Furthermore, it was reported that, quote, several posters were displayed on the outside of the building to the gaze of churchgoers on Sunday mornings. They were printed in glowing colors and stated they would produce the original Parisian can-can in all its glory by 20 of America's shapeliest daughters. So, the can-can, right? In which young ladies kicked their legs up so high that you could see their underclothes? No. In March of 1875, the National Theater was raided by the police, and the girls and the owners and the dancers all hauled into the Philadelphia Court of Quarter Sessions, Judge Ludlow presiding. During the trial, several Philadelphia policemen testified that they had seen high kicking indulged in that was shockingly disgusting and laid over anything they had witnessed before. It was alleged that a mere boy was seen in the audience, mouth agape, holding a program and a pair of opera glasses. However, upon cross-examination by the defense, one of these policemen admitted that he often received free tickets to the shows at Gilmore's, but denied that he'd once been kicked out of the theater for being drunk himself and had sworn revenge. Counsel then asked the witness if they had not been refused drinks at the place. But to this query, the officer replied, no, they never refuse anybody drinks, not even boys. On the whole, the testimony during the trial seemed quite damning, if you take the can-can as prima facie evidence of immorality. The descriptions of sworn witnesses were quite unfit to print, and it seems incredible that any man could have dared to give an entertainment which would have been hissed even in Paris, huffed the Wilmington Daily Commercial in its article about the trial. By April 1st, the jury had arrived at a verdict, and they declared the defendants were not guilty. According to one juror, interviewed later in the Philadelphia Times, consensus among the 12 men during the trial was that it was a put-up job on poor Mr. Gilmore by a rival producer, and they spent most of the time in the jury room playing cards. So much for Philadelphia jurisprudence and entertainment. Those of you who've read my book will recognize the National as the place where in 1876 Annie Kemp Bowler, the original Stalacta, fell onto the stage during a performance of The Black Crook and sadly died shortly thereafter. We do have one rare photograph of that production dated November 6th, 1876, after Annie had already died, which shows a scene from The Black Crook. This is the only source I know of which shows the National's actual stage. A big proscenium arch is flanked by two sets of theater boxes in classic 19th century style. Nothing remarkable, but still a glimpse of a lost theater world. I'll put it, along with all the other places I mentioned in this episode, in an accompanying blog post. In 1878, there was still more tragedy at the National Theatre when a haberdasher named Daniel Archer was killed during an argument in the theater's bar by a sometime actor named Augustus Boyle, a.k.a. Harry G. Richmond. A heavy beer glass was the murder weapon. If you want to hear the whole fascinating and fairly sordid story of this murder, once again, I'm going to recommend to you another podcast. My friend Joe Lex told this story in his show, All Bones Considered, episode 39, an episode that is rather poignantly titled, In Heaven, There Is No Beer. In the year 1917, the National finally closed as a theater. And unlike other similar theaters, it did not become a movie house. I guess there weren't enough people around in the area anymore. The building was sold to the American Ice Company. Most of its interior was torn out at that point and reconfigured. It would remain a site for ice manufacturing and distribution until the mid-1960s. But in the 1970s, again, as the neighborhood underwent an even steeper decline and more significant change, the empty building was severely damaged by a fire, and then it became a food distribution warehouse for a while, until again, it closed for business. During the recent real estate boom in Philadelphia, however, this part of the city has become upscale and desirable to urban pioneers, or gentrifiers if you prefer, and those people have particular economic needs. Just before the current pandemic struck, the building was purchased and remodeled by the Cliffs, a climbing and fitness company, who installed a huge rock climbing and indoor mountaineering complex inside. It was pretty cool. It suffered during the lockdown, of course. Its management changed because it is now called Movement. Movement on Callowhill. You can do yoga and take fitness classes there, as well as do rock climbing. If you walk by it today, you can see that it seems to be doing pretty well. Lots of folks in yoga pants and fitness gear going in and out. I'm not sure if any part of the old stage remains there. I haven't taken a yoga class there myself, I must admit. Probably nothing there. Possibly the large pillar you can see by the entrance door is original to the National Theatre. The tall, rounded lobby windows are all gone, but I would say that for the most part, those exterior walls, that's the old National. It's still there. A theater ghost in plain sight. And nobody seems to know about it but me. And now, I guess you do too. As we continue our walking tour to the west, we'll pass quickly by an establishment called Underground Arts in the basement of a huge old warehouse building near the corner of Callowhill and 12th Street. From about 2009 to 2019, this hosted quite a few plays and performances during the annual Philadelphia Fringe Festival. I saw a few myself. Although, again, since the pandemic, it's become mostly a club where you can listen to rock bands and rap artists. At any rate, we're going to leave Underground Arts for another episode I plan to do when we talk about former industrial sites that have at one time or another been venues for the Fringe. So we're going to keep walking right past Broad Street, past 15th Street, until we pass by this big loop of entrance ramps that lead down to the expressway. There's a huge open area right there. It would be a park, except that there's cars whooshing up and down it in these two looping curls. Then we'll come to 16th Street, and then we're going to make a left, and we're going to head south for about 100 feet, and we're going to stop there, and I will point you to the east and show you nothing. Because I can't point to anything at the former address of the new theater, 311 South 16th Street. 100 years ago, of course, there was a small building right here. Formerly, it was a Well, a religious establishment, again, belonging to the Catholic Total Abstinence Society, an interestingly outgrowth of the temperance movement. This was the Catholic Church's half of it. Most of the temperance movement was Protestant, but this was the Catholic Church's. But then in the 1930s, it left the possession of the Total Abstinence Society, because, of course, Prohibition had come and gone, and the building was converted into the New Theater. Annoyingly, of course, this is one of at least 6 buildings that have been called the New Theater in Philadelphia history, but don't worry about that now because, again, it's not there. Nothing is there. Just empty air. Here's what was here for a few years, according to that invaluable guide written in the 1930s as part of a New Deal project, the WPA Guide to Philadelphia, in its section about the theaters of the Quaker City. Quote, to foster greater cooperation between little theater groups, the New Theater, organized in 1934, sponsored a theater festival in 1936. This marked the 3rd conference of the New Theater League, at which the Philadelphia Center acted as host to more than 100 delegates from similar organizations throughout the country. With the broadcast of a scene from Albert Bynes' Let Freedom Ring in March 1936, the New Theater made its radio debut. In addition to their dramatic activities, these players also maintain a film section, which from time to time has made available to its audiences at low prices such screenplays as 10 Days That Shook the World, Broken Shoes, Poil de Carotte, and Thunder Over Mexico. Outstanding achievement in the dramatic field were the presentations of Black Pit, which moved to the Erlanger Theater, Too Late to Die, which played at the Locust, and the only Philadelphia performance of Let Freedom Ring at their own theater on North 16th Street. Not just theater took place in this building, but the fine arts too, because we can see from an article in the Inquirer for Sunday, January 23rd, 1938, a mural by Razal Kaustin, created for the New Theater, 311 North 16th Street, will be unveiled there tonight. Speakers will include Dr. Albert C. Barnes. In the lobby will be an exhibition of painting and drawings by Joseph Hirsch. So evidently the New Theater must have been quite an organization, and some very interesting and prominent people, like Dr. Barnes, sometimes showed up there, and it was quite an active and earnest little theater group of Philadelphia left-wing intellectuals and theater folk. Jasper Dieter from the Hedgerow worked there for a while, directing a couple of shows, as did Lem Ward, a promising young protege of Dieter's. It sounds amazing. But why don't we know about this place? What happened to the New Theater? Well, I'll tell you why. It turned out that this was a front. In reality, the New Theater was a recruitment arm of the Communist Party of the USA, as were other theater organizations throughout the nation, in New York, and San Francisco, and Chicago, and elsewhere. It all fell apart in 1939, like a lot of activities of the Communist Party at the outbreak of World War II, as first its patron, the Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, which blew everybody's mind, and then was invaded by them. Like other similar theater groups elsewhere in the USA, the New Theater was disbanded. It wouldn't have survived the post-war McCarthy era anyway. But again, I'm just astounded how the New Theater has disappeared from public consciousness so completely. Maybe it was because of the shame during the 1950s and the fear of the anti-communist purges. There are no photos of this theater I can find anywhere. No production stills. Nothing. I think everybody tore them up and flushed them down the toilet. I think if I ever want to find out more about it, I may have to put in a Freedom of Information Act request from old files from the FBI, because I'll bet it was probably under a lot of government surveillance back in the day. But even after the New Theater stopped meeting and producing shows there, the little building it was in at least stayed there for a while, right? Well, yeah, it did. Again, nobody seemed to take any notice of it. I can't find pictures of it. During the 50s, the early 60s, and then at some point this whole block, and many others besides it, along Callowhill, Wood, and Vine Streets, were just torn down and dug up, and the entire neighborhood just vaporized. Where the New Theater once stood is not only empty, there's just some mounds of earth, shaped by a landscape architect into what perhaps the ground looked like before the Europeans ever arrived here. In fact, this is a bit of Philadelphia that the Lenni Lenape might actually recognize, if they just ignore all the huge buildings ringing it, like the Mormon Temple complex nearby. It's a bit of land acknowledgement, I suppose. In this case, when I wave my hand at where the new theater was, I can't see it in my mind's eye. Because I've never found a photograph, I don't know what to see. So far. Anyway, maybe I'll find one someday. There's an archive somewhere in the city, I just know, where there are photos and letters and newspaper clippings and play scripts and photos of eager people, hard at work, happy in their craft. The dead theaters and ghosts of Callowhill Street are just waiting to be discovered and to haunt us once again. I'm Peter Schmitz. Our opening and closing theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci, Schumann's Etude Symphonique, played by Shura Cherkassky. I'll put images of the places I talked about today on the website. Thanks for being a part of my audio walking tour. Thank you for supporting the podcast and for coming along with me on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.